A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Peng Ting and I'm from the Center for Liveable Cities. Welcome to our CLC lecture series. In today's session, we are honored to have with us our distinguished speaker, Mrs. Carrie Lam, Secretary for Development of the Hong Kong SAR Government. The subsequent Q&A discussion will be moderated by Prof. Lily Kong, Vice President, University and Global Relations of the National University of Singapore. Before the dialogue begins, please put your hands together and welcome Ms. Chang Hui-Ni, Deputy Secretary Planning of the Ministry of National Development, to say a few words. DS, please.
The Honourable Mrs. Carrie Lam, Secretary for Development, Hong Kong SAR Government, distinguished guests, fellow colleagues. A very warm welcome to the Centre for Liveable Cities lecture series. Today we're indeed very honoured to have Mrs. Carrie Lam as our distinguished speaker. I think for those who may not be very familiar with CLC, well, it's jointly established by the Ministry of National Development and the Ministry of the Environment and Water Resource in 2007 to distill, create, and share knowledge on livable and sustainable cities. The CLC lecture series is one of the platforms through which urban thought leaders share best practices and exchange views and experiences. And today's lecture is jointly organized by CLC and the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. I'd now like to say a few words about our distinguished speaker. Mrs. Carrie Lam has been appointed as Hong Kong's Secretary for Development since 2007. And prior to this, Mrs. Lam had an illustrious civil service career spanning 27 years in various positions as Permanent Secretary for Home Affairs and the Director General of the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office in London. While Mrs. Lam is no stranger to urban conservation, I think prior to this, she was served as the Permanent Secretary for Housing, Planning and Lands. And as a Secretary for Development, she now oversees a diverse portfolio that includes city planning, land administration, urban renewal, and heritage conservation. Well, Hong Kong is a very exciting global city. I think many of us have visited Hong Kong. We love the food, shopping there, and we're very energized with the very fast pace of city living. And I think just like Hong Kong, Singapore has also seen very rapid transformation over the years. While all these changes have raised the quality of life and the standard of living for the people, both in Hong Kong and Singapore, I think we also share similar challenges in having to develop very scarce land resources amid rapid population growth and very increasingly complex urban developments. So how do we strike a very fine balance between remembering the past and providing for the future? How do we manage these trade-offs that often have to be made between conservation and development? So we are therefore very privileged to have with us Mrs. Carrie Lam to share her insights and perspectives. I think in recent years, the Hong Kong government has placed a very strong emphasis on heritage conservation and the preservation of local culture. So in this lecture, Mrs. Lam will discuss a paradigm shift in Hong Kong's heritage conservation, and so share with us the success factors in embracing heritage while taking forward this city's continued economic development in a very sustainable and progressive manner. So we look forward to learning from Mrs. Lam's thoughts and sharings on managing these tensions between preserving our heritage and forging greater economic growth. There will be a Q&A session after Mrs. Lam's lecture, moderated by Professor Lily Kong, who is a leading authority on urban conservation in Singapore. In addition to being a CLC Research Fellow, Prof. Kong is also currently the Vice President of NUS and Acting Executive Vice President of the Yale NUS College. She has written very extensively on urban conservation in Singapore, and she recently just completed a book commissioned by URA titled Conserving the Past, Creating the Future, Urban Heritage in Singapore. So now, without further ado, I'd like to invite Mrs. Lam to deliver the speech.
Thank you very much, Winnie, for the introduction. Professor Gong, friends of Singapore departments and agencies, it really gives me great privilege and honor to be invited to speak at this lecture of the Center for Livable Cities and jointly organized by the Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. As Winnie mentioned, I took up the position of Secretary for Development in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region Government on 1st July 2007. Prior to that, like Winnie, I was a senior civil servant at the rank of Permanent Secretary. But in 2007, I have to resign, quit from the civil service, and took up what we call a ministerial or political position. So now I have a fixed term of 5 years, which will end of next month. In my 5 years as a Secretary for Development, this is my 5th visit to Singapore. So on average, you can say that I came here once every year. I came here not for the food, not for the shopping, not for the casino. I came here to learn, okay, and to be inspired by what Singapore government and as a city and your people have done to make this a very successful and vibrant city. So I don't come here this afternoon to tell you what we have achieved, but very much I come here with the mentality that since I have learned from Singapore in the last 4 or 5 years, so as a good student, I come here to present to you my interim report card on how I have done with the things I have learned from Singapore. And I look forward to the later Q&A or exchange session to be moderated by Lily. I'm sure I will continue to be inspired by views and comments expressed by the audience this afternoon. I call this presentation a paradigm shift in Hong Kong's heritage conservation work, because unlike Singapore, we only come to realize and recognize the importance of preserving a city's history, heritage, intangible culture very recently. This is not strange because as many of you who have visited Hong Kong, you will agree that Hong Kong as a city is very famous for her rapidly changing cityscape, with old buildings giving way to skyscrapers. So for those of you who have not been to Hong Kong for a while, maybe a couple of years, and upon arrival, you will be telling yourself, oh, things have changed again. A few buildings have popped up and the usual cityscape, streetscape have changed. This is understandable because of intense population pressure and growth over the years and very constrained land use. So I'm showing you 2 diagrams here. In the chart, you can see that Hong Kong's population has grown very rapidly by almost 1 million every decade since the 1950s. But interestingly, in the last decade, the growth in population have somewhat moderated. Between 2001 and 2010, Hong Kong's population had grown only by about 367,000. And we have done a full census last year and should be about to disclose the future projections, which are likely to indicate that this growth in population is going to be moderated. And on the one hand, you'll feel that then, okay, you have lesser pressure, then you can do other things. But on the other hand, I am personally quite worried about our demographics because of the aging in population. But coming back, this population growth has of course put a lot of pressure on the way the city has to respond in order to provide the needed housing, infrastructure, social facilities for our people. And then if you look at the use of land, of course, in terms of size, I've just seen the URA diagram. In terms of size, Hong Kong is larger than Singapore. We have 1,100 square kilometers compared to your 700 so. But in terms of how we use our land, we are very constrained because of our topography. And also because of a policy adopted many years ago to preserve as much as possible the countryside, which means we have chosen a very concentrated mode of development and hence high density and so on. You can see from this diagram that 66.8% of our land are woodland, shrubland, grassland, wetland. And amongst the 1,100 square kilometers, 46% of the land could not be touched because they are all protected by statute under the Country Parks Ordinance. So the public will be guarding this 46% of land very vigilantly. They will not allow the government to tap into the country parks to provide land to meet our various needs. So even up to this moment, the so-called developed land in Hong Kong accounts for only less than 1/4. So the 23% of land is a built-up area. So if you do a little bit of calculation, the 7 million population in Hong Kong were actually crammed into no more than 260 kilometers, giving rise to an intensity of 27,000 inhabitants per square kilometers. So when people complain about the small size of flats that our people live in, the congested environment, we have to be very conscious and bear in mind that this is the sort of development mode that Hong Kong has adopted over the years. Now, but the quality global metropolis aspires for economic progress as well as benefits to culture, to the society, and to the environment. So in recent years, Hong Kong people have expressed passion for our culture and for our lifestyle. The photos you see here are all protest action in the last 10 years or so, from protecting the Victoria Harbour, so no more reclamation please, to protecting historic features like a private mansion here, and also the Queen's Pier, which has to be removed or knocked down in order to make way for a major piece of transport infrastructure. I understand Lang is also now being very annoyed by the need to remove some cemeteries to make way for a major road. I was in exactly the same situation five years ago. So this little photo of me sitting in front of protesters was taken in the summer of 2007. In fact, it was into the first month when I took up this position. I was asked to go down to meet the protesters who have been doing hunger strike there for almost a week. All young people. You wonder why. These young people in the 20s and 30s, they have not had this experience of the past. Why were they so passionate about these historic structures? So I think as a city, we really need to ponder over this reaction of our younger generation and try to respond to this positively. So having been given this portfolio of a Secretary for Development, who is both the Development Secretary, that is to press ahead with Hong Kong's infrastructure development, city planning, land use, but at the same time also Hong Kong's Antiquities Authority. I have to really strike this balance in a very delicate and sensitive way if we were to continue to take forward infrastructure. But at the same time, I certainly do not want to go down to meet the protesters a second time. And fortunately, I really do not have to do that in the last 5 years, having done the Queen's Pier in the summer of 2007. So I would say that in the past 5 years, we have embraced people's passion and try to press ahead with our work on heritage conservation. And that is what I mean by a paradigm shift. We do not oppose this passion for heritage conservation. Instead, we embrace it and try to find a way out. So I just show you very quickly some of the key events in the heritage conservation agenda in the last 5 years before I share with you what I regard as some of the necessary factors in order to take forward a heritage conservation agenda in the midst of a city which still continues wants to develop and to progress. Now, the first event, again, was a very dramatic one that took place in September 2007. Is to save a historic mansion which was owned by private owners called Ging Yin Lei in Cantonese. It was built in the 1930s. So in September 2007, the property changed hands. The old owner sold it to a new owner. The new owner came in and wanted to demolish the building. But he knew that to go for formal demolition, he required a permit from the Buildings Authority. So instead of doing demolition and exposed his plan to the Buildings Authority, which might then take some action, he has chosen to deface the building. So it's actually to tear down all the features of this building, the tiles, the sculptures, and things like that. So it did not constitute demolition in the building ordinance sense. The incident was, of course, reported by media, and within a matter of a couple of days, I stepped in to use my powers under the ordinance as a statutory antiquities authority to declare the whole mansion and the site as a proposed monument. Our law empowers us, the Antiquities Authority, to declare privately owned property as proposed monument for a period of up to 12 months. In other words, to give us a breathing period while putting that building under statutory protection. But the 12-month period cannot be extended, so a solution has to be found within that 12-month period. So having announced the declaration of this historic mansion, we started negotiations with the owner. And very fortunate, within a few months, we came up with a solution to do a land swap with the owner. And this is really God-given. You see from this site plan at the bottom of the slide, the green bounded area, is the privately owned site where there is this historic mansion. It's a very beautiful mansion. And right next to it, there is a man-made slope. It is not a site. It is not a site as if I would sell as a land authority in auction or tender. It is just a man-made slope which was created when we stabilized the Stubbs Road, okay? But it happens to be almost exactly the same size, okay? And if you look at the color of the vegetation, where this is very heavily vegetated, this doesn't have that degree of vegetation, although in planning terms, it is zoned green belt. And green belt zones are not supposed to be developed. There's a presumption against development on green belt zones. So we discussed with the owner, what about doing a land swap? That we will give you exactly the same site area, 4,705 square meters, and we will give you exactly the same plot ratio, which is 0.5, and exactly the same building height control, which is 3 stories on carport. The owner said yes. Then we took the case to the Town Planning Board for rezoning. Now, this is a very interesting point. In a normal situation, if the government were to sell this green belt zone site via rezoning for money, for land revenue, I'm sure the community would oppose us. Why do you have to give up a piece of green belt site? But in this particular case, the case went through Town Planning Board without much objection, because people realized that the purpose of rezoning was to save a historic mansion, which is far more valuable than the greenbelt sites, because we still have quite a lot of greenbelt sites. And this is really not one of those heavily vegetated area. So we managed to save this building through this land swap. I'll come back to how we deal with private property in heritage conservation. But this is the first example of doing a land swap in preserving privately owned heritage. I mentioned about preserving not only the built heritage, but also some local culture, some street characteristics. So the second spot that I have managed to save was Tai Yuen Street Openair Bazaar, which is in the older parts of Wanchai, where, as you can see from these photos, they are very vibrant. They are very well loved by local people and also by visitors. In fact, the Hong Kong Tourism Board in Hong Kong, they used to survey amongst the visitors to Hong Kong, which are the places most loved by you as a tourist. And these open-air markets normally will come within the first 3 places, together with Hong Kong Disneyland, Ocean Park, and things like that. They would always be within the first 3 places, Hong Kong's open-air bazaars, where it is in the women's streets or these electronic streets and so on. This open-air bazaar was supposed to be demolished to make way for a URA project to revitalize the whole area and for some road traffic and so on. Again, at that time, there was a lot of protests, so I managed to persuade the various government departments and the URA that perhaps we do not need to remove the Openair Bazaar. We could find other ways to deal with the traffic problems and so on. So the market is now still very vibrant in Hong Kong. In fact, we went on to invite the URA to improve these market stores for them, to put in separate electricity and also to give them some nicely decorated stores. Now, this is another project in Wanchai. In fact, in those days, Wanchai was under a lot of pressure because of urban redevelopment, a lot of projects going on at the same time. So the original plan, which we have signed off with the developer, is to demolish this Grade 3 historic building, which is the Wanchai Market. It's a streamlined modern architecture built in the 1930s. The beauty or the characteristic, of course, lies in this curtilinear facade of the market. But as you know, in Hong Kong, we pride ourselves on being a place where there's a rule of law. We respect contracts signed. So in this case, it is not a matter of government intervention. I could not go in as a statutory authority and tell the developer, you stop doing this thing. This is not right, because I still have to weigh those I regard as core values in Hong Kong. So instead, we used persuasion. Together with the URA chairman, whom you see here, Mr. Barry Zhou, we went to see the developer, and having negotiated for a while, the developer finally agreed to adopt what we call a core preservation approach. In other words, as you can see here, in the new building, the facade and about 46% of the old market building will be preserved. But behind it, they will continue to build what they have been promised to build, which is a residential project. Then I have to look at some of the government sites originally planned for sale. This is on Hollywood Road. As you know, Hollywood Road is a very vibrant area with a lot of arts, antiquities, galleries. Originally, we were supposed to sell this site, which was occupied by some former police merit quarters, including my chief executive, Mr. Donald Zhang. He actually lived in these quarters when he was a child because his father was a policeman. But at the point when I took over the portfolio, this site was a very sought-after residential site, a high-density residential site supposed to be for sale. I did a number of tricks on the chief executive. So finally, the chief executive agreed to pull the site out from the sale list, our application list, and we will revitalize it into a creative industries landmark on Hollywood Road, so as to create synergy with the arts and antiquities galleries. The site will then become called PMQ in the acronym. It will provide 130 studios for designers and designers who have this entrepreneurial potential. It also has some lodges for designers in residence, just to reflect its past, being a quarter for families. And we will preserve, by and large, the two police merit quarters block, but we will build some new facilities to connect the two blocks, which provide an eye-curb. The historic significance of this site lies not in the buildings. The buildings are pretty contemporary, built in the 1950s. But the historic significance of the site lies in it being the original site of the Central School, which is Hong Kong's first government secondary school, and which is the school where Dr. Sun Yat-sen went to when he was in Hong Kong, although not on this site. The Central School that Dr. Sun Yat-sen went to was on another site very close by. But the second generation of that Central School was on this site until the Second World War. It was bombed and destroyed. And the current generation of the Central School is the Queen's College in Causeway Bay. So it is with this sort of background, because we unearthed some of the foundations of the old Central School. So this will be preserved through some underground interpretation areas in future. The CE was already not happy with me pulling out a very valuable site costing billions of dollars. I continued to upset him by removing the Central Market site from sale the following year. Now, this Central Market site, again, was a 1930s building. Some said it was Bauhaus, some said it was a modern streamlined architecture, but never mind. It is a very interesting building in the heart of Central, okay? We're surrounded by skyscrapers and beautiful financial buildings. So again, it was supposed to be sold. It has been put on the application list for developed into a 45-story office building with sitting on a 4-story car park, that sort of landscape. So you would imagine that if the building were to give way to this high-rise building, not only will we lose a piece of historic building, but the whole area will be sort of suffocated. Even the air ventilation, these days we're talking about urban heat island effect, will have very adverse consequences. So it is not only for heritage reasons, but also for urban design and city reasons that I persuaded the CE to pull this site from sale as well. So what would it become? It would become the Central Oasis, which is a hangout area in Central for workers in Central, and also for visitors during weekends, so that Central also have some vibrancy as a core business district. And I have been telling some friends in Singapore that the inspiration for doing Central Market came from Singapore. In 2008, I think, I was driven around the Singapore's old financial district and look at this market stores called La Bazaar. And I then found out from some friends that it was a very important piece of architectural facility. So I actually told the CE, if Singapore could spare the site from sale and turn into and retain this cooked food store, Hong Kong should also be able to do that sort of thing. Okay, so eventually he agreed, and the Central Market is now being handed over to the URA to do this transformation, because URA has a few revitalization and redevelopment projects in the vicinity. Now, in the same period, we realized that perhaps just doing individual buildings is not good enough. So we did a little bit of area research and discovered that there is this area which actually still have quite a number of interesting historic buildings, and that is Hong Kong Central District, which is Hong Kong CBD. Within the CBD, we have identified a total of 8 projects. 7 of them are historic buildings, like the Central Market, the Central Police Station, the Marriott Quarters on Hollywood Road, and even the government complexes in CGO. And there is one which is a natural heritage, and that is the Victoria Harbour Front. After finishing the final reclamation for the trunk road, we will have a beautiful Central Harbour Front. So together we pull these 8 projects together and do a little bit of what we call area-based conservation. Because unlike Singapore, we already do not have one single area or more areas in which we are able to preserve. They are, because of the economic pressure over the years, most of them have been given way to modern buildings. So where we still have this capacity to do something, we decided that we'll go for conserving Central. So we have announced that we will preserve each and every of these 8 projects in Central. Now, in October 2010, we opened the first historic buildings being revitalized. So it's merely in a mere 2 years we have done this project. This is a Grade 3 historic building, which is a former magistracy in Sam Sui Po. The project was transformed through a competitive process. By the way, in all the things we have done, we put a lot of emphasis on transparency, on level playing field. So we do not just hand over historic building to one agency. We run exercises to invite proposals, to look at designs before we decide to partner with a particular agency. And this time, we partner with an American institution, which is the Savannah College of Art and Design, to set up its first campus in Asia. That is in our North Kowloon Magistracy building. It was opened in October 2010, now have a full-time student enrollment of 250 in various degree programs. Now then, in January 2011, I did another thing, which is, of course, very difficult. In the same way as Ging Yin Lei, this beautiful Ho Tong Gardens, which belonged to the Sir Robert Ho Tong, which was at the turn of the 19th to 20th century, a very famous Eurasian who did a lot of community things for Hong Kong. He still have this Ho Tong Gardens on the peak, okay? And the third generation, that is Sir Robert Houghton's granddaughter, wanted to demolish the Houghton Gardens. Had she done it 10 years ago, she would succeed, but not now. So again, I stepped in and used my authority to declare it a proposed monument, okay, and stop the demolition. And you remember I said that this proposed monument has only a life of 12 months. So by now, we are already May 2012. That proposed monument protection has lapsed, okay. Originally, I should have then followed through to do a formal declaration on a permanent basis. But because in order to give me more room to negotiate with the owner on any other means, like land exchange, things like that, I have not gone one step further yet. At the same time, she has put in a petition to the chief executive to oppose my work. So we are still now being in a situation of dealing with the petitions on the one hand, and also to talk to her. But I think the negotiations with her have ceased because she is not willing to do any land exchange with the government. So this is going to be a very hot potato that I need to deal with at the remainder of my term, that is between now and end June. I don't want to pass on these problems to the next secretary, so I have promised myself that I will handle this thing before end June. And I can tell you in confidence that there's no other solution but to declare it as a monument, given its significance both architecturally and socially and historically. How we are going to compensate the owner, I'll come to in a moment. Now, having done a few years of work, I felt that perhaps we could impress upon the chief executive that we have done something good. Don't worry about your land sales and so on. So we hosted a very successful international conference on heritage conservation last December with a lot of international experts from UNESCO, from France, from UK, New York City, Landmark Commission Chairman, and so on. And as part and parcel of our international networking work. Now, all these key events took place in the last 4 or 5 years in Hong Kong on heritage conservation. So if I were to do a little wrap-up at this point in time, how could we manage to do these sort of things in these few years? I have a few factors to share with you, and I think many of those should be common to Singapore. First is, it would not be possible to do anything without a leader's mandate, okay? So the chief executive has somehow promised the people of Hong Kong in his manifesto, because the chief executive also have to run elections. So in 2007, he promises voters and constituents that in his election platform manifesto, that we will maintain Hong Kong's development as an international global financial center. We will maintain the impetus of infrastructural development while preserving our environmental qualities and preservation of our heritage. Of course, this pledge went into his manifesto because that was the period when there was a lot of social protests in Hong Kong, arising from a demolition of a Star Ferry, arising from a demolition of Queen's Pier and other things. So in that sort of context, the chief executive have to promise the people that he will accord higher priority to heritage preservation work in Hong Kong. And he went on further in his first policy address called A New Direction for Hong Kong, and that was delivered in October 2007, that he recognized that cultural life is also a key component of a quality city life. And so if Hong Kong wants to be a progressive city, it's not just about economic progress, not about GDP growth. We also have to treasure our own culture and our history and our own living experience, which is unique to Hong Kong. He also recognized that the passion that I have shared with you about people, showing this passion in various forms. And so he said that this is something we should cherish, and speaking really to the young people. So in the next 5 years, he said we will press ahead with our work on heritage conservation. With that sort of mandate, we managed to roll out the things that I have briefly described. And I do not give up every occasion when the CE speaks. I put in a little thing about heritage so that this leader's mandate will be a continuous one. Otherwise, people will forget about, oh, there is a leader's mandate. So when he when he accepted the invitation to talk to a group of overseas journalists in the FCC, the Foreign Correspondents Club, in 2009, I persuaded him to talk about heritage, because the FCC in Hong Kong is housed in a historic building. It's a former dairy farm building right on the verge of Hollywood Road, where there's a lot of heritage and history there. So in this particular speech, the chief executive acknowledged that we have not done our job very well in the past. And that's why he said, to a certain extent, it's true that when people said that the government has not done enough in this regard, that is heritage conservation. But today, it is equally true to say that this government has ushered in a new era of Hong Kong as far as protecting our built heritage is concerned. So that leader's mandate has gone a further step, that, which is very useful for myself, because we'll then flag this thing when we face troubles with other bureaus and departments. At the opening of SCED Hong Kong in October 2010, of course, again, based on our contribution, he said that as a government, we were hesitant at the beginning about investing in heritage conservation, because these are very valuable building and land assets, and some of the most valuable things we have in Hong Kong, because we don't have natural resources. So the CE himself was a bit cynical at the beginning of turning these valuable assets into something which are not making profit, because he feels that Hong Kong prides itself on profit-making, on commercialization, particularly for a capitalistic people or a place like Hong Kong, okay, where we are brought up in that sort of setting. But he said that I now believe that we have done something right by going for a not-for-profit use of some of our valuable assets. And what's more, we feel at the same time that at the local level, this type of projects are bringing a lot of benefits to the local districts. In this case, SCED Hong Kong is accommodated in the poorest district in Hong Kong called Sam Sui Po. If you look at the various indexes, this is a district with the largest number of poor people, lowest income, and so on. So through this revitalization project, not only the SCED Hong Kong, but other in the vicinity, like the Mayhall House, which is Hong Kong's first public rental housing, which again will be preserved, locals and visitors will be able to rediscover the history of its neighborhood. It also brings a lot of people flow to the area and helps to create jobs in the local economy. Now, the second factor, of course, it's good to have the leader's mandate, but in order to execute the leader's vision, we need to have the right tools. And the first set of right tools is the right institution, so what I call the institutional arrangements. Development Bureau is in fact created for the first time in Hong Kong's history in this term of government. Prior to that, heritage conservation was always hand in hand with culture, which is the case in many governments. But in this term of a government, Development Bureau has not only the planning and lands arm, including urban renewal, but also the works arm, which is the works departments in architectural services, drainage, water supplies, and so on. We also have the heritage portfolio, although it's a very tiny one amongst my various departments and portfolios. So this setup is very conducive to facilitating heritage conservation, which I'll show you in a moment. Now, first of all is things that are going to undermine heritage very often is development, including infrastructure. So I'm both the infrastructure secretary and also the heritage secretary. So this ensures that at the very beginning of capital works planning, we will have to embrace the need to preserve heritage. So it's not at the end. Somebody has decided to build a road, then it affects heritage. Then we have to accept the consequence and do mitigation. Nowadays, we said that at the very beginning of planning or conceiving a piece of infrastructure, you better be very careful whether you're going to touch any of these historic buildings. The second is, as you can see from the case of Ging Yin Lei, land is very valuable in Hong Kong. So if an historic building is owned by a private owner, how could we compensate that owner? You can do it by cash, but that's not going to take you very far because taxpayers would not like to spend billions of money to preserve old buildings. So to have the planning and lands and urban renewal arm within the Heritage Authority means that I have a mandate to offer economic incentives in the form of planning control relaxation or land exchange in order to save that historic building. The third is historic buildings that need adaptive reuse. We have to go through all those new building regimes and so on. So you need to have people within the same family who are very sympathetic to old buildings. So instead of rigidly applying the building codes and requiring all this sort of barrier-free accesses and the height of the staircase and things like that. So I now have within the same family the buildings department, which controls the buildings and the alterations of all private buildings in Hong Kong, and the architectural services building, which is the government builder under one roof. So they will provide the needed technical support to the revitalization of Hong Kong's historic buildings. And apart from this institutional arrangement at the higher level, the first thing that I have created in Development Bureau to look after the heritage conservation portfolio is a Commissioner for Heritage Office. It's actually only at the AD level, it's an assistant director or principal assistant secretary level. But the need or the beauty of creating an office with this name, Commissioner for Heritage, is that this office is a mission-driven, advocacy-based body. So anybody in Hong Kong who has a subject, an issue, a topic, a project about heritage, he or she does not have to think twice. You go to the Commissioner for Heritage office. This office will embrace your idea and try to take your idea through the very difficult government machinery, because the office exists for no other purpose but to preserve Hong Kong's heritage. And what's more, within this office of about 40 people, I have said at the very beginning that I don't want the whole office to be staffed by civil servants. I want this continuous cross-fertilization of ideas from outside people. So half of them are civil servants, half of them are outside people who can come in to do a contract of 2 years and then go out and so on. So by this way, I hope that what we are doing, or the passion that we have, will gradually have a spillover effect into more people. Now, but before I move on to the third factor, I'm very sorry to share with you that the factor 2 may disappear soon. Because the chief executive-elect, who will take office from the 1st of July this year, has decided to dismantle Development Bureau. I feel it is a pity, but I hope that the bright side of it is perhaps the work that we have done has laid such a strong foundation that regardless of what happens or what institution the next government will have, they will continue to do all the good work that we have been doing. In the next term of a government, the structure will look like this. Development Bureau will be split into 3 parts. The planning and lands part of Development Bureau will marry up with housing. So become housing, planning and lands, which is back to the pre-2007 situation. The works arm of Development Bureau will be combined with transport to become the Transport and Works Bureau, which is also logical because infrastructure includes also transport infrastructure. And the heritage component, which is a very small component, will go into a new bureau called the Culture Bureau. So in a way, it's also logical. Now that you got a dedicated Culture Bureau, heritage will be elevated to a much higher status as an important part in a Culture Bureau, which takes in not only the built heritage, but also the intangible heritage. And so I wish it luck, that hope the new institution will work well. Now, the third factor to guide the work that we have done is the needed tools in other aspects. We need to have a very clear policy to tell people. We need to have the effective legislation and the administrative framework in place. So in 2007 September, with the support and endorsement of the Chief Executive in Council, that is the Cabinet, we promulgated this policy statement. In a nutshell, it has embraced some of the key elements. So we want to protect, conserve, and revitalize as appropriate historical and heritage sites and buildings through relevant and sustainable approaches for the benefit and enjoyment of present and future generations. Because we realize that historic buildings are not homogeneous. Some historic buildings could be given a new lease of life, turned into a hotel. Others perhaps have to be protected like an antique. You don't touch it, but you just ensure that they're properly maintained. So this appropriate treatment of historic buildings is very important. But in implementing this policy, we also pledged that we will give due regard to a number of factors. First is development needs in the public interest. So we are not saying yet that there's no more development, everybody must listen to the heritage. We're saying that we need a more balanced approach in development and conservation. We put it at the very forefront, the need to respect private property rights, because this is a core value in Hong Kong. If Hong Kong loses that, Hong Kong will lose half of its advantages and attraction to foreign investors. We also need to pay attention to budgetary considerations, so you cannot always look to the treasury to give you money to buy out these historic buildings. We also want to have cross-sector collaboration and active engagement of stakeholders and the general public. So these are the words which are guiding our heritage conservation work in the last few years. Now, this ordinance has always been there since 1972. This is a very important piece of ordinance to provide for the preservation of objects of historical significance. Particularly, we have this Section 6, which gives me the authority as the Antiquities Authority to prevent any person, including the owner, to excavate and carry out any works in a building or site which has been declared monument. We do have some monuments which are privately owned by schools and by other things. And even those privately owned monuments, they cannot do things at will. They have to come to me for a permit whenever they want to do something in the buildings. And then I mentioned about the Ho Tung Gardens. If we could not resolve by negotiation, then we have to resolve according to Section 8, which gives the owner the right to seek compensation from the government in respect of financial loss suffered from situations as specified in the ordinance. This particular provision somehow has never been invoked in the past, because we all know that once it is invoked, we're talking about astronomical compensation costs. So every time we try to avoid Section 8, but I'm not sure that we could continue to avoid it with Ho Tung Gardens, because I have tried various means of compensation through land exchange with the owner, but it still doesn't meet with her approval. Apart from monument declaration, there are other historic buildings which may not meet the very high threshold for monument, but they are also very interesting and valuable historic buildings. So the Antiquities Advisory Board, which is my key advisor on antiquities matters, they have adopted an administrative grading system into Grade 1, Grade 2, Grade 3. Depending on the merits and the significance of the buildings. Normally, Grade 1 buildings will be regarded as a pool for potential monument declaration. In fact, Ho Tung Gardens has been graded a Grade 1 prior to the owner's demolition work. So once a Grade 1 building is under threat, the Antiquities Authority more or less will do this automatic proposed monument to put it under protection. We have identified, or the expert panel comprising historians and architects, have identified 1,444 historic buildings in Hong Kong. They have done the first round of grading, but each and every building's grading has to go through a confirmation by the Antiquities and Advisory Board. So far, they have confirmed the grading of 909 buildings. Another 200 so do not deserve any grading, so they still have another 200 to go. But these 200 buildings are going to be the most difficult buildings, where there are a lot of objections from the owner about our intention to give it a grading. Now, I mentioned about the advantage of having the works departments under the Development Bureau's purview is because we could impose these assessments in the public works projects. So since 1st January 2008, we have put in an administrative requirement. We don't have to go through the law because these are all government projects. We said that whoever wants to do capital works projects in the government, including the Mass Transit Railway Corporation, because it's also largely owned by the government, they have to go through heritage impact assessment. Okay, that is the initial screening. Over 2,600 projects of different scale have gone through this heritage impact screening in the last 4 years. As a result of which, the Antiquities and Monuments Office has required 31 of them to go through a full HIA in order to assess the impact on the heritage sites. So this is what I call prevention, sort of, rather than mitigation. We try to prevent at the early part of the process. Now, the fourth factor is very important, it's money. If you don't have money, it's very difficult to do this job, okay? So we are fortunate at the very beginning of this term, we have been given a total of $2 billion in several tranches by the Treasury to do this revitalization work of government historic buildings. On top of that, we were given another $100 million to support the operating deficits in some of these revitalized buildings in the initial 2 years. In other words, we expect them to be self-financing in the long run. So they will generate some revenue as a social enterprise to sustain the operation, whether it's a school, a hotel, a restaurant, a hostel. But initially, if they are running deficits, we help them by up to $5 million per project. We also provide them with advisory service. But the $2 billion is not the only money that we have. In 2007, to celebrate Hong Kong's 10th anniversary in the reunification, the Hong Kong Jockey Club has come up with this proposal to help revitalize the Central Police Station compound. I'll show you a photo later on. It is a cluster of beautiful monument buildings in the heart of Central, which comprises a police station, a magistracy, and a prison, 3-in-1 type of compound. So the Jockey Club has committed $1.8 billion to do one single project of revitalization. And then there is a URA, which is always very supportive of our work. URA is a statutory corporation, which is also running on a self-financing basis through real estate developments. The URA by now has committed another $2 billion to preserve the pre-war shophouses in Hong Kong, not as extensive as in Singapore, and also the Central Market that I has just shown you. So together, we're talking about $5–6 billion being put in this program in the last 5 years. Without this funding support, most of the things that I've been talking to you would not happen, because the taxpayers are not very willing to shoulder this cost when we have still a lot of problems to overcome, like poverty, housing, welfare, and hospital, and so on. So under the revitalization scheme, we now have 13 projects. The revitalization scheme works like this, because we told ourselves at the beginning that perhaps don't go for too commercialized approach by selling the land. We did do that if you have visited the 1881 Heritage in Tsim Sha Tsui, which has been transformed into a very upmarket shopping mall and Howlett House Hotel. That was a land tender. So not that we don't put in money, we still collect a very handsome land premium by giving the developer a 50-year lease to do that revitalization. Although the land conditions impose some conservation, but the product is very different because the developer has to maximize the profit in order to recoup the land premium and to give itself a profit. So for this revitalization scheme, through partnership, the government is responsible for the capital cost for the renovation from the $2 billion I just mentioned. We pick, through a very competitive process, the right project and the right operator. The operator has to be a not-for-profit entity, okay? So they can make a profit from the operation, but their existence is not for profit making. So they are subject to inland revenue control. They cannot distribute dividends to their shareholders. They have to keep the profit or the surplus within the project to enrich the project. So in other words, they are running what we call in Hong Kong a social enterprise. By now, we have completed 3 of these projects. 6 are under pre-construction and construction works, whereas 4 are still under a selection process. Just quickly take you through some of the projects. The 3 completed projects, including this one I just mentioned, which is SCAT Hong Kong. And in addition to making good use of this North Kowloon Magistracy building, the project has won Hong Kong and UNESCO Asia Pacific Heritage Award for Culture Heritage Conservation last year. This is the second project opened in a fishing village called Tai O. It's an old Tai O police station dating back to 110 years ago, okay? It's now revitalized in a Tai O Heritage Hotel. This project should be particularly of relevance and interest to Singapore because the operator, and so in fact also the family operating the Fullerton Hotel. I have brought myself a souvenir book for the center, but because, as you know, how could the Far East or the Sino do this project, because they are companies. So the story is like this. The father and son of Sino, that is Robert Ng and his son Darrell, they formed themselves into a company under the Inland Revenue Ordinance, which is a Hong Kong Heritage Conservation Foundation. And they put in a proposal on a competitive basis. And they won the project with our money, with taxpayers' money. They renovated the project, which became a very nice tile heritage hotel, opened in March this year with only 9 suites. It's a very tiny hotel, but it's a beautiful one. Another is, again, a very interesting thing. This is Lui Seng Chun, which is a residence of the Lui family, who also started the KMB, the Kowloon Motor Bus in Hong Kong, okay? So they actually gave this building to the government about 10 years ago. They actually, without asking for any remuneration, any money, they gave this building, and this building in the heart of Kowloon. It's not in the rural areas, in the heart of Kowloon. Because the Lui family, young generations are all very successful professionals, okay? And they felt that it would be a great pity to knock down the building to give way for real estate. So they gave the building to the government, and under the scheme, we selected the Hong Kong Baptist University to revitalize this private mansion into a Chinese medicine and healthcare center. Which is very relevant because Lui Seng Chun in those days was also a herbal medicine. And the Lui family has this philanthropy to serve the people. So in this herbal medicine clinic, they are offering free sessions to the low-income patients. Now, other projects under construction, including this cluster of buildings in Lai Chi Kok, which were previous sort of rehabilitation homes and a little prison in the 1930s and so on. So this will be transformed into an arts gallery for the promotion of Chinese culture. Subsequently, the chief executive decided that the whole project should be named after a very renowned scholar, Professor Yao Zhongyi, who is, of course, in his mid-90s. He went down to the site to look at the thing, and we are going to open the phase 1 of this gallery with Professor Yao's works in June in next month. Now, this is Hong Kong's first public rental housing, built after a major fire in Shek Kip Mei in 1954, Christmas. Everything has been knocked down because we need to upgrade our public rental housing, but we have retained this block, okay? Just to remind ourselves that this is Hong Kong's public rental housing history. So we took over this building from the Housing Authority and put it under the scheme, and it was then given to the Hong Kong Youth Hostels Association, turned into an international youth hostel, again, resembling the youth previously as housing. But the great virtue of this building lies not in the hardware. It lies in the software. So the project proponent has, for 2 years now, gathered a lot of people who have been very successful now, but they came from very humble background and beginning, living in this block or in the vicinity. So these successful men in their 50s now are retelling the story of Hong Kong. This what we call the Lime Rock spirit, that you don't need to be fearful about your humble background or about being poor. But you need to have that spirit in order to succeed. So I personally find a lot of value in this project, not only on the software, not on the hardware, but actually on the software side. They also established an alumni club on site, welcoming all the previous Shek Kip Mei and the Mei Ho House residents to come back and to tell stories about how they share this very little cubicles 50 years ago and the neighborhood spirit and so on. Now, this is a Blue House project, again, which has a very unique characteristic. This Blue House cluster with all those pre-war tenement buildings, they don't, up to this day, they don't even have their own toilets, okay? It's very poor hygienic conditions. Originally, it was a URA project, and URA have never contemplated to demolish the building. They said they would preserve it, but the way they preserve it has received a lot of opposition because they want to evict all the tenants and then renovate the building and then find an operator, maybe a F&B and things like that, like what they have done to the pawn shop, which is another historic building in Wanchai. The residents disliked the idea because they said that we have been living here for decades. although the conditions were not good, we were very attached to the building and to the neighborhood. And together with some social activists, then they drum up a lot of protest action to change course, so to speak. So I went down to meet with them on a Sunday morning because I go to church every Sunday in this area. So and I talked to the people and felt that they have a point. And after all, we have nothing to lose. We wanted to preserve this building anyway. So why do we need to do our way? Why can't we do it their way? So we are now going forward their way, which is preserving not only the buildings, but the people. How do we preserve the people? In Chinese, this is called 老屋要老人. So we asked the 22 families living in the Blue House cluster, do you want to stay or do you want to go? If you want to go, we'll give you a nice public rental housing or give you a cash allowance. If you want to stay, then we will upgrade this premises with some toilets and things. Then you continue to live here. But once you continue to live here, you become part of the living heritage. You will have to participate in the scheme as dozens, guided tours, and things like that. And they said yes. They said yes. So they now become a part of this project together with NGO, the St. James Settlement. So all these, I think about half of them prefer to stay, half of them have moved. The 12 families or so, they are very active participants in this project. They help to choose the architects, the designers, and look after the tendering and the works and so on and so on. So it's a very happy ending to what was originally a major protest in this area. There are some green projects in our historic buildings. This is an old Tai Po police station in the New Territories. So it is given to the Kaduri agricultural group to turn it into a green hub for sustainable living. So they will promote green living in this area. Now, in the batch 3, which we have received over 30 proposals, we are still under a selection process done by a group of advisors. I don't sit on the committee to choose. One of my motto is I try to share power and decision-making with other people. So there is a group chaired by a non-official, comprising mainly non-officials, to look at these proposals and to recommend to me which one to select. So these 4 buildings are very sought after. At least 3 of them are very sought after. One is the Gengyin Lake, which has been fully restored after a 3-year restoration program overseen by a very renowned professor from the Guangzhou Architecture University. So it has been fully restored, the tiles and the architecture, the sculpture, and so on. And then we have the Tiger Balm Garden Mansion, or the Haopa Mansion. We have a Bridges Street Market, which used to be the American missionary where Dr. Sun Yat-sen was baptized 110 years ago. And then we have another Fanling Magistracy, which is a court building. So I do not know yet what are going to be the adaptive reuses of these new projects. Now, beyond the ART scheme, there are other interesting projects. One is, of course, this 1.8 billion project done by Jockey Club, the Central Police Station compound. Because they are more resourceful, so they have invited very famous architect, Herzog and de Meuron, the Swiss architect who designed the bird's nest in the Beijing Olympic, to be the design architect for this cluster of buildings. Basically, they will preserve all the monument buildings. They just add 2 little boxes and 2 of the buildings to provide the art gallery and the exhibition space. It will become a hub for heritage, entertainment, arts, and performance, and so on. Another is, of course, the Hollywood Road former police merit quarters that I just mentioned. URA has other pre-war shop houses project, and this is one of it, which is, of course, at a very advanced stage. It's also in Wanchai. This is in Mallory Street, called the Green House. We have the blue house over there. This is a green house because it's painted green. So we are going to collaborate with the Hong Kong Arts Center to make this a comics home base. That is for animation, for comics, for artists to work and showcase their work. Now, beyond those historic buildings, we have potential for revitalization, for an adaptive reuse. Other buildings need only to be maintained properly, okay? So in order to induce the owners, the private owners, to properly maintain their historic buildings, we run a financial assistance scheme providing on a per project basis 1 million Hong Kong dollars. So a building could have several projects over a period of time. Each project is counted once for the 1 million cap. So these are some of the projects assisted under the financial scheme. Basically, they are rural houses and study halls and temples in the new territories. Now, the fifth factor that we need to pay a lot of attention is this respect for private property rights. We cannot just take over people's property and assets in a place like Hong Kong. So in the case of King Yin Lei, which I have just covered, this is a land swap with the owner. And the whole process was record-breaking. It takes us only a total less than 16 months to start to finish. And in fact, the owner is now building on the yellow bounded site, whereas the green bounded historic mansion is now owned by government. Not only have I not spent a single dollar on this land swap, I have actually managed to give the Treasury $53 million as a result of the land exchange. Because in Hong Kong, we have this very sophisticated system of assessing every piece of land on its before and after value. So the before value of King Yin Lei is the before value, is purchase price, which is about $250 million, okay? But the King Yin Lei lease has a very special thing, that is one house rule. You can build up to 0.5 plot ratio, but you can only build one house. But the new owner on this new site with the same footprint wants to build 5 villas because it doesn't make sense to build one house of 2,300 square meters in Hong Kong. So he wanted to build 5 villas. We said yes. Then we assessed the after value and discovered that 5 villas cost more than one big house in Hong Kong on this location. So reluctantly, the owner has to even pay us a premium of over $50 million. So this is a very good case. Whenever the Treasury officials are after me about how expensive your heritage work is, I said, no, I'm getting some revenue for you through this lease modification tricks. And this is exactly what they will get from this project. They will get a very hefty premium from this project. This is called Jasview, again built in the 1930s on Pok Fu Lam Road, which is next to the Hong Kong University. Originally, of course, the owner wanted to knock down the Jasview and to build high-rise building on top. We said that, no, we don't want you to knock down this building. But because the footprint of this site is large enough, it enables the new owner to build around this private mansion and turn this private mansion into the clubhouse with a bit of public access. What is my inference over this project? And that is very unique. And that's why every project is unique. This project is unique. There's no land exchange. Why did the owner have to listen to me? It's because this whole Pok Fu Lam area is put under a moratorium. Nobody could build under the Pok Fu Lam area because of the traffic congestion. So every case has to be exceptionally agreed by the government before you could build, despite the fact you own land, despite your land has potential to redevelop and build. So the so-called incentive that we have given to the owners, if you do it our way, we will give you exceptional approval to build. In other words, we have lifted the moratorium for this special case, but they still have to come forward for a lease modification, and they will have to pay a rather hefty premium on this because the old lease only, again, gives them very restricted GFA to build. Now, this is a church project, the Sing Kong Mui compound, which is on Lower Albert Road. It has 4 historic buildings, including the Archbishop Mansion, which you see here. And with a very congested footprint, there's no way that they could do a good scheme preserving the 4 historic buildings while building new structures to accommodate the expanded needs of the church and the welfare center of the church. So instead of building everything on this site, we asked the church whether you still have other land throughout Hong Kong. And they came up with this site, which is also on Hong Kong Island in Mount Butler, occupied by a little kindergarten of the church. Then we said, okay, transfer a plot ratio. You transfer all the plot ratio to that kindergarten site, and you don't build too much on the central site. So this is another way of trying to preserve the historic buildings, which could be applied to privately owned buildings as well. Now, this is a very interesting project, which I'm seeing some very promising signs that sometimes perhaps we don't have to do a lot. This is pre-war shop houses bought by an owner on Prince Edward Road West. Originally, again, he wanted to knock down the whole building and build a hotel. But on his own volition, voluntarily, but it's not picked up by us, he came to us, came to the Heritage Office, because he had read about some heritage work. So he came to the Heritage Office and asked whether we want to cooperate with him to preserve as much as possible the facade of this interesting pre-shop houses. We said yes. So as a result of that, he is keeping the front portion of a building, which will become the future reception for the hotel building, and built behind it. The project is only facilitated by a minor relaxation of plot ratio. In other words, whatever they preserve, we said that this should not be accountable GFA. You can build up to the plot ratio. So, but now that he has done it, every time he sees me, he complains. Because by preserving the front portion, this building is very difficult to build. The lifting of these heavy machines, he said that it will have jacked up the building cost by at least 20–30%. But he has one thing to ask from me. He said that, will you come to open my hotel? Since I have done this goodwill thing for the guy, I said yes. Regardless of whatever position, I'll be happily doing this opening for you next year. Now, this is a very major project with a very major company called the China Light and Power, the CLP, on Argyle Street. If you will drive through this, you will not miss this building, this clock tower, which of course 1930s clock tower of the China Light and Power. They already have an approved scheme from the buildings department to demolish everything and build several residential towers. But it is a Grade 1 building, which means that it will be a potential monument. So I personally discussed with the Kaduri family and persuaded them to do other things. So they now ended up with this preservation cum development scheme, which will preserve not the entirety, but at least the most important part of a historic building, which is the clock tower. The little wings, which originally were separate staff quarters, not connected to this clock tower, will be demolished, and they will build the residential towers. And this is facilitated again by minor relaxation of the building height and the plot ratio in order to accommodate the new buildings. What is more interesting is the Kaduri family suggested that they would keep the clock tower building and provide two museums, two private museums in the clock tower building for public use. One is Electricity Museum, talk about history of electricity supply in Hong Kong. The other is to talk about Hong Kong's heritage, basically along the lines of the Kaduri family's presence in Hong Kong over the last century. Now, this final one was a Barker Road project, which of course is on a very prestigious area on the park, on the peak. So this is only a Grade 3 building, so we cannot ask for too much from the owner. So the preservation cum development scheme takes the form of preserving the villa's facade. And they were built behind it, so basically at a distance when you look at it, you still get this feel of being a historic mansion. I have no solution yet for the Ho Tong Gardens, except to say that all the instruments that I have used in the past 4 years have been tested on this case. In fact, I've given them an additional thing that I never use in Hong Kong, and I cannot tell you because this is very confidential. It has never been talked about at all in Hong Kong. But still, that doesn't meet with her approval. So if the carrots do not work, the stick will have to come out. We'll have to use my authority as an antiquities authority and to declare it a monument soon. Right. Now, another factor is, of course, community participation. I think more and more my friends in Singapore government are very concerned about how we can get people more involved and participated so that they would not see themselves as very alien from what the government is doing. So this is also our guiding principle from day one. So we involve them through various things. One is, of course, through sitting on our advisory boards and statutory bodies like the Antiquities Advisory Board, and also this committee set up specifically to select projects under the revitalization scheme. We also work with academia, which doesn't seem to be very prevalent here, I was told. We work very closely with academia to commission them to do various sort of studies in various parts of Hong Kong about the historic significance. Just on Ho Tong Garden alone, we have commissioned 2 studies, both by Hong Kong University. One is on the architectural significance by the Department of Architecture in Hong Kong University. The other is about the historical significance of the Ho Tung family in Hong Kong by a very renowned sociologist, Professor Wang Xiulun, and his colleague. And both came to the same conclusion, that this site and this building is just too important for Hong Kong to lose. And that gives me the basis to go forward with my statutory actions. We also set up district working group where we are going for area-based revitalization like the Openair Bazaar and other things, or development of heritage trails and so on. We have district working groups to work with the stakeholders and also the local district councils. We organize open days whenever possible, and the passion for Hong Kong people is unbelievable. The opening of Ging Yin Lei alone has attracted some 35,000 visitors over several weekends. We have guided tours for schools and students, and particularly we also do a lot of guided tours for the disadvantaged families. Because I have been Hong Kong's Director of Social Welfare, so I realize that there is still a sizable population in Hong Kong, especially the children, who are not given the same access to this fun, this enjoyment, and so on. So we particularly run Sunday programs for them. We bus them from Tin Shui Wai, from some of the remote areas. We give them a lunch box, and we took them around our heritage buildings. The same for people with disabilities. We took wheelchair people along some of our heritage buildings. We also run a lot of exhibitions, and some were taken aboard to Beijing and to other areas about our heritage work. And we develop heritage trails. This is a very interesting heritage trail with a group of waterworks monuments, because the first infrastructure Hong Kong built is waterworks in order to supply fresh water to the growing population. So this is at Tai Tam. We have a cluster of historic buildings in Tai Tam, so we developed this Waterworks Heritage Trail for people to enjoy, providing maps and guided tours and so on. And in order to take heritage conservation education forward, we need to start with schools. So we developed teaching kits for distribution to all the secondary schools for teachers to teach, especially now that we are moving on to a new curriculum that put a lot of emphasis on liberal studies. We run competitions of all sorts, drawing competitions and so on. We do a heritage fiesta on a fun week. The whole week is about open days for various heritage buildings, websites, newsletters, and so on, which you can get from our website. Now that we have done some work, we also attach importance to international recognition and networking, because heritage, after all, is a very international issue. It is also an issue which builds up this relationship between states and cities. So the first thing is, you may not realize, although we were a latecomer in heritage conservation, Hong Kong has a total of 13 buildings being awarded under the UNESCO Asia Pacific Heritage Awards, which put us in maybe number 3 ranking after Pakistan and I think perhaps India. These are the buildings which have won out awards. The latest is, of course, SCED Hong Kong. Whenever I go out, I call on my counterparts in the heritage work, whether they are the English Heritage, the National Trust, the Heritage Council, or of course, in the case of Singapore, we went to see the Far East Square and all these national museums and Fullerton and so on. As a result of that, we have sufficient networking to invite experts to come to Hong Kong to talk to us at last December's International Conference on Heritage Conservation. Now, in moving forward, I see a lot of synergy in Hong Kong at the district level. So we should weave these work together into an interesting area, which of course Singapore has a lot of examples to show us, because you move into those districts well ahead of the demolition and all this redevelopment. Hong Kong does not have that privilege, so to speak. So it is now up to us to create that synergy at the district level. For example, you imagine all those projects I mentioned to you on Hollywood Road, Central Police Station, Police Merit Quarters, Bridges Street, and so on. So in time to come, they should be woven together with Lan Kwai Fong and Soho and the vicinity and become a very interesting district with a lot of culture, arts, history, and interesting beverages outlets and so on. The same with Wanchai, which URA has done a lot of urban regeneration projects. We have preserved some of the historic buildings, so they will form a very interesting cluster. In Tai O, now that the Tai O Heritage Hotel had become the anchor in Tai O, we could build on that and revitalize this fishing village. There's steel houses, there's, which we call the Venice of Hong Kong. That's with all this interesting waterways, which can be regenerated. In this poor district of Sam Sui Bo, I expect some of our projects to really inject some energy into this district and create some jobs for the young people. Now, the challenges ahead, as I see it, is, because this is only my interim report card, there are more work to be done in Hong Kong. One is how to garner, create greater support and appreciation by private owners so that it need not be every time it's tough negotiations. It could be some win-win situation that some voluntary efforts of the private owners is something I like to see. Second is, as we are at the very beginning of our attempt to revitalize historic buildings, the sustainability of these projects are very important. In case they are not able to sustain, then the government needs to step in, or they might be left to be dilapidated again. That is not something we would like to see. So the sustainability is a key issue. Except that so far so good. The Tai O Heritage Hotel is doing very well with an occupancy of 90% plus. And the SCED Hong Kong is doing very well on a private university fee-paying basis and so on. The third is the availability of conservation experts and skilled workers to support all these projects and work. And as a result of the work done by the government, the 2 universities in Hong Kong have now started additional programs on conservation. The Hong Kong University Department of Architecture, from this September onwards, will have a new undergraduate program, which is the first ever undergraduate program in conservation, funded by the government. It's not a self-financing program, it's a funded program. Whereas the Chinese University in Hong Kong will have a master program in conservation to start this September. My last assignment for myself in this term is to sort of make a case for the establishment of a heritage trust in Hong Kong. I don't feel that all this work that I have discussed with you should all be undertaken by government, by civil servants. I think it needs to have much broad-based support by going right into the public and the people. So a membership-based heritage trust will be able to take over much of the work that I have just described to you, except perhaps the Antiquities Authority statutory function has to continue with the government. But all the other things like revitalization, like education, like guided tours, all this could go to a heritage trust. And this is something that we have commissioned a consultancy with a report ready for the next administration on the 1st of July. So I thank you very much for your patience. I am a bit long-winded whenever I talk about heritage, because while I started to do this portfolio, rather reluctantly, because with the Queen's Pier protesters that I have to handle, I finished my job as a Secretary for Development with a great passion and love for this work, not only in Hong Kong, but worldwide. So that's why I want to thank particularly my friends in Singapore who have given me a lot of inspiration from my various visits in this term of government. And I look forward to more exchanges and collaboration between our 2 cities. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Lam. I'll now like to invite Mrs. Lam and our moderator, Prof. Kong, on stage for the Q&A session. Ladies and gentlemen, please state your name and organization before asking questions or making comments. You may use the microphones along the aisles. I will now hand the time over to Mrs. Lam and Prof. Kong.
Thank you very much, Peng Ting. Mrs. Lam, thank you so much for an extremely stimulating and very insightful talk. I'm certain that I speak for everyone when I say that your enthusiasm, your commitment to the job is palpable, and that's extremely admirable. Thank you. I think we have about half an hour in which we might engage in dialogue. And as Mrs. Lam mentioned earlier, this is an opportunity not just to ask questions, but to share your own insights and thoughts and comments. And Mrs. Lam would very much appreciate that this is a dialogue more than necessarily a Q&A session. I take the opportunity of being moderator perhaps to jump in first before the rest get their say. And I'd like to begin by asking, you know, the very many projects that you've described, in a sense, had a great deal of you in it, in a sense, and your team in it, sort of putting the case forward for conservation, etc. One question that is very much in my mind is how far the private sector does get involved in this. Do you see a change in attitudes towards heritage and conservation, a willingness to step forward? I ask this because when I think of other cities, other global cities, particularly in the West, you get the private sector stepping forward to say, we're proud of our heritage, and we're proud of this being our building, and we want to see it, you know, sort of preserved for posterity, and we're willing to do our part for it. I think it's fair to say that in Singapore, we don't quite see that yet. I would be very keen to hear your thoughts about the situation in Hong Kong and how you think that might be further encouraged.
Well, I think very much like Singapore, our private sector has not displayed that sort of appreciation yet. And that's why I said in the final slide that one of the challenges is how to instill that sort of appreciation in the private sector. But having said that, there are some very encouraging signs recently. For example, I mentioned about this Wanchai Market being preserved using a core preservation approach. They started to do the pre-sale launch a few months ago. And the advertisement reads like this: it is celebrated architecture, celebrated lifestyle. So they're actually capitalizing on their project, having this historic component to it. And elsewhere, we're also seeing a bit of that the private sector starts to see that, oh, if heritage becomes part of my project, there is an additional selling point to the project. So I would say that we are seeing some positive signs. If the people of Hong Kong embrace more this, I think the private sector will respond. As far as the government is concerned, we could also facilitate, for example, in terms of this planning relaxations, building high flood ratio. We can also facilitate by having a building authority, which is more sympathetic. Sometimes the private sector complains is because it's very difficult to comply with the building code in order to preserve parts of the historic building. So they rather demolish the whole thing. So again, this is an area that we could facilitate in order to make it easier for them to support any preservation work. But at the end of the day, it is really like that hotel owner. I hope that we will be seeing more of this voluntary sort of thing. The Barker Road case is also a voluntary. In fact, we have another case I did not show you. It's another voluntary case. They have bought a property on the peak, and they came forward to talk to us. Can I do a better project that you will welcome? Of course, having done that, they expect us to come out to embrace them, to give them a good image, because these days corporates also like to have a good image and so on. So for example, for the China Light and Power, on the day they submitted the planning application to the Town Planning Board, I came out to talk to the media and commending CLP. But unfortunately, within a few months, they did a major fare increase and then gave them a very bad image immediately, offsetting all the good things that I have said about the China Light and Power in Hong Kong. So I hope to see that through various ways that we'll be able to impress upon the private sector that this is a trend. Just follow the trend and do some good things.
Thank you. Yes, please. Please do introduce yourself first.
Yeah, no, it is. Very good afternoon to Mrs. Carrie Lam, Secretary for Development in Hong Kong Special Administrative Region Government, and to Professor Lily Kong and members of the audience. My name is Marina and my company is Audacity. I would like to ask you a question that's outside of your board work as antiquities and all. If I were to expand the definition of heritage, preserving Hong Kong's heritage, you have done a wonderful job of preserving its physical heritage. How would you preserve, let's say, just to describe briefly, the way of life and the sense of rootedness of the present generation for generations to come? Meaning how Hong Kong wants to be 50 years from now, as it is right now, to continue enjoying for the next 5 decades. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that question. In fact, this is something that is right now that is very close to my heart, because I'm seeing our younger generation in Hong Kong apparently haven't got that sense of direction, unlike when we were young. So I'm not I did study sociology, but I wasn't a social scientist. So I'm speaking without the benefit of evidence and research. But I do feel that we really need, as a society, to do something in order to restore that sense of hope, that sense of confidence in Hong Kong, especially amongst the younger generation. Partly because, of course, there's globalization where jobs are not as secure as in our days, and also because of this security of job is no longer the same as when we first joined the government or in the private sector. And also because of this heated property prices, this inability to share the fruits of economic progress, to buy a flat and so on and so on. Young people are apparently losing a bit of hope in Hong Kong. So how to restore that spirit is something going to be a big challenge for us. That's why you mentioned I spent a bit of time on the Mayhall House, because I see that project not, the merit lies not in making good use of some former public rental housing units, but to use that project as an anchor to try to revive that can-do spirit, that self-reliant spirit, that resilience amongst Hong Kong people, that despite a lot of difficulties, which date back in the 50s, Hong Kong has a lot of difficulties. We don't even have a roof over our top. Many people are living in squatter huts on the hillside, and so on. So in order to really to confront current day problems and try to move on and continue to develop themselves and Hong Kong as a society. But moving beyond that, I think intangible heritage is also very important. Although at the moment it lies under the Home Affairs Bureau, which looks after culture. In future, there will be this opportunity to bring intangible heritage and build heritage under one roof together. And maybe that will provide further impetus for how we could marry the two. It's not just the built heritage, it's also the intangible heritage. In the case of Ho Tung family, if you have a chance to read the consultancy report by the sociologist Professor Wong, a lot of emphasis was actually put on the intangible side. How a man, a Eurasian, who was very low in the social strata in those days, have moved up the social ladder in those days 100 years ago, and then gave back to the community through a lot of philanthropy. How the wife of this man has, out of love for his children, managed to persuade the then colonial government to allow the family, which is the first ever family in Hong Kong, to build on the peak, which was supposed for Westerners. Nobody other than Westerners could build on the peak in those days. So it is these elements which emerge out of the report, which convince us that preserving Ho Tung Gardens is not just preserving Ho Tung Gardens, it's preserving that very important part of Hong Kong's history.
Hello, Mrs. Lam. I have a question as like this. Yeah, you've talked about the, I respect how you work for preserving the buildings is privately owned. But it seems to me that is it like the government-owned building? There is a possible way that can treat better? I'm sorry that I need to talk about your hot potato against the government hill, because when you talk about government hill, you set the value based on its the financial and legal status. But I want to add something more on the government hill. I'm a researcher at the National Library, and I research about the history and heritage in several Southeast Asian cities. I find that the government hill indeed tells stories about how the British built the colonial port cities. Like in Singapore, the Fort Canning is also the government hill, and it's like this. The British will choose like some coastal area, and if there is a hill, they will occupy the hill and to have their political and governor house there. So it is the historical value that is it's not only about Hong Kong but about the whole Southeast Asian region. If it is add this value more into it. And I think the whole story about the government here will be different. And personally, I don't think that...
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'd like to give the opportunity to as many people as possible. So could you be sharp about the question?
Is it like if you need more office space, right? And in the Conserving Central project, you have the Murray building. And the Murray building is for office use at this moment. And if there is the need of office space, why can't this too can be like shift of the use, and the whole government hill can be retained and preserved with the more historical value? Thanks very much.
Thank you.
It appears that our concerned group in Hong Kong has a lot of influence in Singapore. You better be very careful. This thing is infectious. Now, let me put it that way. I did not mention about just office space in my earlier explanation to this question. It's also about what we call cultural landscape improvements. If you have a chance to come to Hong Kong, I'll show you the model that we have done on the future of that whole area, which the demolition of West Wing is justified in order to make way for much better public access to the open area and then all the way to the botanical garden. But of course, some could accuse us of saying that, okay, if that's the case and if West Wing could be demolished, you just demolish it. Don't build anything in place of it. But this is not what the Hong Kong style is. I just mentioned it. We need to strike a balance between the development needs as well as heritage conservation. Otherwise, after 5 years of very vigilant work, we will end up, in the eyes of many people, I think up to this moment, in the debate over the so-called government hill, the conservation group is a minority. It's a very tiny minority. The lot of majority, including a lot of politicians and a lot of other professional bodies, including some of the Hong Kong Institute and also some conservation architects in Hong Kong, do not feel that we need to preserve this old building and do not feel that we could not build anything in its place. There are some monuments in Hong Kong, monumental site, which we allow the preservation of old buildings, but we build some new structures in order to ensure that the totality is functional, benefits the public, and so on and so on. So it is with that in mind that we still feel that we have come up with a balanced scheme in the interest of Hong Kong. That will not appease the concerned group and the conservation activists, but this is really something for the public to debate. And they have debated this for a couple of years already, and we have said that the mainstream view, and in fact it's backed up by when we went to Legislative Council, which is our parliament, the conservation people said that our view was not the mainstream view and they want a public hearing. But the Legislative Council did not accept the request for a public hearing. They said that the matter has been settled. It's only waiting for the government to come out to announce the final outcome for the scheme. So I realize I may not be able to convince every one of you and all my stakeholders in Hong Kong, but the challenge of being a public official is really to find the best solution for the overall interest in Hong Kong, and not just to try to avoid confrontation or avoid resistance from a certain sector of the population.
Thank you. There's time for a couple more questions. Mr. Liu, please.
Liu Tiger from Center for Liveable Cities. First of all, I'd like to say that you submitted your interim report with flying color. I have 3 questions, 2 heritage related and 1 general question. You talk about carrot and stick. I would like to know more about the stick. Second is that you talk about establishing the Heritage Trust. I would like to ask, in what way you wish that the trust would advance the cause of conservation? The last question is, you say that the population growth in Hong Kong has slowed down. What are the reasons?
Well, let me address the final question first. Well, the main reason is because of very low birth rate in Hong Kong. Somebody told me that Singapore is 1.2. Ours is just slightly over 1, I think. It used to be 0.9, okay? So that's the sort of situation. So if not because of immigrants from the mainland of China, we would be seeing negative growth for a while, okay? We have not grown more in the years. It's because I think somehow our expatriate population has not grown in the last 10 years. There are several reasons to it. First is, you could say that we already have a very sizable expatriate population, so there's a limit to how far you can grow. But the main reason is because we are not able to overcome some of the problems which the expatriate community attaches a lot of importance to. One is the cost, especially the cost of offices and properties. The other is the quality of living, particularly in air pollution. If you go to any chamber, overseas chamber in Hong Kong, the first issue they put on the table is air pollution. You better do something about your air pollution, otherwise I'm not going to come. The third is about education for the kids. We don't have enough international school places. But strangely, it's not because we don't have enough international schools. I think we have more international schools and school places in Singapore. But it's very difficult for expatriates to get a place because we do not have a policy to deny the local population admission into the international schools. So any parent who is not particularly keen about the local education will send their kids into the international school. So they take up some of the places. And of course, over the years, we have not been very conscious in adopting a more aggressive or progressive policy in attracting overseas talents to Hong Kong, okay? So I think these are the reasons for Hong Kong's population demographic situation. As regards your 2 questions on heritage, the stick really lies in the Antiquities Ordinance, which gives me the power to declare a privately owned building as monument. And once declared, the owner cannot do anything without my permit. For example, in this case, if the owner wants to demolish, she could apply, but I never agree, so she could not build. So then it goes on, then she will seek compensation, okay? Then we will negotiate, and if we could not agree amongst ourselves, then she would take me to court, to the district court. It's written in the law. But what was not written in the law is what is the quantum of compensation. What is the degree of financial loss? Because I have not taken away her property. She still owns it, except that she could not build on it. Then if the quantum of compensation is on the basis of the plot ratio or GFA that she has been denied to build, then it's a very astronomical cost. Mind you, it's on the peak, okay? But this has never been tested in court. So I don't know what will be the cost of this stake. This comes with a cost as well. But at least demolition is out of a question once it is put under statutory declaration. As far as the Heritage Trust is concerned, in fact, I have a little table, but I have not brought it with me. There are a list of functions or work that we have to do in heritage conservation. So about half of them could go to a heritage trust. Half of them should continue with the government. For example, declaration. For example, offering economic incentive. You can't give it to a non-government organization to offer incentive in planning ratios and building height relaxation and so on. But there's a lot of work, especially in terms of involving the community, in terms of public participation that could be better done by a heritage trust rather than by the government. Okay, so there will be some, what I call shared ownership of this portfolio. So I would imagine that if there's going to be a heritage trust in Hong Kong, the government will vest all these properties which are being revitalized to the trust. Just like in the UK National Trust, all these castles, gardens were being given to the National Trust, very much sometimes as a gift from the owner. In our case, we can vest the buildings and the land to this heritage trust, so when they can generate revenue, they can have some revenue. Where they cannot generate revenue, then the trust will have to look after these buildings and continue to allow some public access and so on. The Heritage Trust could do a lot of research and upgrading of training, skills, and so on. It definitely will have a major role to play in terms of public education, where they're outreaching into schools and so on. So by and large, we have, I have a pretty clear picture of the division of work between the government body and the Heritage Trust. The next question is, how do we set up a trust? Do we need a piece of law, or could it be an incorporation on its own? Or how do we finance a trust? Do we give them a major seed money grant? Or what? So, but these are really the technical details to sort out by the next administration.
Thank you very much. I think we've taken a great deal of your time this afternoon. I will again take the privilege of the moderator to ask the last question, and that is, I was very struck that in your first month in this particular role, you had to go and face a bunch of protesters. If Huini was asked to go and face a bunch of protesters tomorrow about Bukit Brown, for example, what would your piece of advice be in terms of dealing with the community?
Don't speak as an official. Don't speak as a bureaucrat to these protesters. Try to have some empathy. Try to tell them that you understand why they are so radical, why they are so impatient, why they are so radical. In fact, I said two things. I sat there for 4 or 5 hours. That Sunday afternoon, it's very hot. Okay, I said two things. I said when I was young, like you people, I was a student activist, which was true. When I was in a university, I was a student activist. I went to protest in front of the central government offices on behalf of the boat people, and so on and so on. So I understand that young people have something which we officials might not fully understand when we became officials, but I have gone through that, so I respect your passion. So I'm not coming here to lecture that you have done the wrong thing, you have wasted our time, you have stopped my project, and so on. So try to have a little bit of empathy with why these young people are doing this sort of thing. And then I try another thing is the soft side. I said, I'm a mother. I said, I'm a mother of 2 young sons of your age. Okay. So I feel very sorry if my sons are going through this hunger strike. So please go home. Otherwise you'll get your mother very upset. Okay. I don't know whether that worked, but a few days later we cleared the site and we started our project.
On that note, thank you very much for giving us your time and sharing your wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Lam and Prof. Kong, for sharing your insights and experience with us. We would now like to invite DS to present Mrs. Lam with a token of appreciation. DS, please. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our lecture. Before you leave, please hand the completed feedback forms to my colleagues at the exits. Thank you and have a good evening.